Stories told about 3 women who died on the same day and went up to heaven and stood outside the pearly gates. And St. Peter said to the first one, "Well, what did you do in your life that you think you deserve to come into heaven?" And she said, "Well, St. Peter, I was a physician, and I really cared for my patients, and I did my best to restore them to good health." And he said, "Come right in." And to the second he said, "What did you do?" She said, "I was a nurse, and I really gave my patients loving care, and I helped to nurse them back to health." And he said, "Welcome, come right in." And the third woman said, "Well, I headed up an HMO, and I tried my best to contain the costs for medical care." Well, St. Peter thought for a moment and said, "Well, come in, but no matter what, you have to leave after 2 days." Sometimes humor opens the door to a discussion, and the discussion in the gospel especially today is, who's going to get into heaven? And why? And what must you do to try to deserve, if you will, St. Peter's welcome? The main point in the gospel is that it's not enough simply to have been part of the chosen people or baptized as we are. It wasn't even enough to have eaten and socialized with Jesus, that there was more expected if you were to be welcomed into heaven. The Charlie Brown of comic strip and TV fame often quotes Scripture, but there's a favorite cartoon of mine that doesn't speak about Scripture per se, but it does give us the lesson of the gospel, and I've shared with this before, so you may have heard it. But the scene is that Charlie Brown is looking out the window and it's starting to snow. And he can't wait to get out and play. So he starts to get ready. And he puts on several sweaters, and he puts on a jacket and a hat and lots of scarves. And he opens the door, and he goes to go out, and he's so heavy that he can't get through the door. And Charlie Brown screams, and that's the end of the comic strip. But that image might be helpful when we start talking about the narrow gate, and that it's difficult to get through the narrow gate. And perhaps it's not because the gate is so narrow, but that we have encumbered ourselves with layers and layers of things, decisions, lack of values that really make it impossible for us to get through. Perhaps the gospel is an invitation for us to look in a value, if you will, mirror, and see how it is that we have layered ourselves, sometimes with selfishness and sin, that argues against us going through the narrow gate. Maybe we've layered ourselves with this selfishness or indifference to the needs of others, or maybe it's the so-called 7 deadly sins: pride, envy, anger, sloth, greed, gluttony, lust. Maybe those are the things that make it impossible for us to be welcomed. The lesson today is to understand that Jesus does invite us in, but we need to respond by the way that we live so that it makes it possible to get through the narrow door, and so that we can stay not just for 2 days, but for eternity.